A shout amongst the Aborigines attracted my attention. On looking, I saw an Englishman beating the blacks. They called out to me, and I ran and demanded the reason of his thus acting. He replied that the blacks insulted him, but I found that a little girl about 10 years of age had hid herself in the water from his violence, and that it was the father of the girl the man was beating, because he would not consent to his little daughter being taken away by the fellow. I argued with a bench of 3 magistrates. 2 were against me, and 1 viewed the matter as I did. At length they agreed to my request that the Aborigines are under British protection and cannot be assaulted with impunity. The man was ordered to appear on the following day.
An Englishman basically gets on a rocket ship and goes to the moon. That's what it'd be like.
Just looking at his image, immediately, Threakell, we go, he looks like a cranky old bugger.
I see him as a bit of a hothead, but at the same time very meticulous in what he was doing. Passionate and meticulous. I kind of, like him.
Sent out here by the London Missionary Society to work specifically with the local people.
The impact of Threlkeld the missionary on Aboriginal life here, historically and certainly at the time, were monumental.
He walked into a colony that was quite horrendous in terms of what was going on to the Aboriginal people. He walked in almost as their protector.
And he spoke out against atrocities that were happening in this region. Massacres and the killings of Aboriginal people, the raiding of graves.
Wrote a number of important letters to the governors of the time, stating the case for taking care of Aboriginal or First people.
Threlkeld was 200 years ahead of his time as a super progressive man.
His emphasis on land rights and he even uses the word invaders, to refer to European people as invaders. That's only come in the last few years. I mean, Threakeld's writing about in 1828.
He was going into a space where he was not going to get a lot of support and was going to be, in some respects, and talking in a religious sense, was going to be crucified for it.
At the same time, he was trying to do something very difficult. I mean, no one else at this time would have undertaken a task like translating the Bible into a language that everyone thought, was just gobbledygook.
Threakeld learns their language with the help of an Aboriginal leader of that time, whose name was Biraban.
None of this would have happened except for this incredible Aboriginal man, Biraban.
The true first documentation of an Aboriginal language in Australia.
Biraban has been looked upon as the greatest 19th century Aboriginal scholar. His bilingual capabilities was also driven by a need to protect Aboriginal culture and spirituality.
They are the conduit through which the traditional language of this region has come down to us.
Biraban and Threakeld's partnership was very significant, particularly to those of us who are working in language revival.
Linguists are still using it worldwide.
We also know the importance of local dreaming stories, and I've recorded for the community over the years something like 27 stories which are embedded in Threakeld's writings. The greatest collection of Aboriginal cultural knowledge and history stories in southeastern Australia. That's unquestioned.
The lesson of them working together collaboratively and collegially a couple of hundred years ago is a very great lesson for us today.
The space these 2 men were in can be looked upon as the third space. You've got the British space, you've got the Aboriginal space, and there's this in-between third space. And both of those men were in that space, trying to find connection.
You very much get the impression through the writings that they were mates, they were good friends, and they enjoyed the work that they were doing.
He and Biraban were daily companions over a period of almost 20 years. So, that says something about the warmth of the relationship and its continuity.
Novocastrians should be so enormously proud of this story. This is an incredible piece of work that happened right here in Newcastle, Lake Macquarie, in our Hunter Valley. This happened here. It didn't happen anywhere else in Australia, and we have the opportunity to share this and this knowledge from our local Indigenous people with all Australians, and in fact the world, because the more we learn about this and we understand it, of course, the prouder we're going to be of it, and the more we want to share it with the rest of the world. Everyone else shares their fabulous ancient peoples with us. We're lucky to still have the descendants of a very ancient people living with us today.
I see Threakeld was born in England, tried a number of trades. He was an actor and a businessman as well, and failed at all of those things and decided to become a missionary. So it's a straight, I don't see actor in the background of many of these individuals. So he hits me as someone that was a bit odd. The London Missionary Society were like breakaway Protestants that formed their own religion, and Threlkeld was ordained as a Congregationalist. I think they were anti-imposing church governance, and they were trying to convert native peoples to the Word of God through the Bible without the church baggage. But he becomes a missionary, and that then sends his life on a trajectory to the islands of French Polynesia, loses a child, then he loses his wife. So there's a lot of tragedy involved during those 5 years in the Pacific before he arrives in Australia.
When Threlkeld was in the Pacific as a missionary, it was there that his real interest in language and linguistics was lit.
Especially the way the Tahitian language works, and I think that prepared him for what he was going to be doing later in Newcastle.
He had a really good grounding in English grammar because the Missionary Society put their missionaries through an English grammar instruction so that they were able to do the translation work that was required. Threlkeld arrived in Australia.
They're on their trip back to England. So they call in here to Sydney.
And the first thing he did, he hit his late father-in-law's property down on the Hawkesbury and straight away started writing word lists. He was going to preach to the local people in their own language.
The London Missionary Society suggests that they open up a mission at Moreton Bay. That doesn't work, and then they suggest maybe another mission in the Lake Macquarie or Reed's Mistake, and that's where Threlkeld decided to build his mission. When Threlkeld arrived here in 1825, I don't think the authorities saw him as a friend of the Europeans. They put him 1.5 miles out at the government farm. There's a beautiful drawing of it in the Wallace album, and that's where the Aboriginal people were now spending most of their time as they were slowly being pushed out of their areas.
We can look at Joseph Lycett's incredible artwork, which again demonstrates the rich Aboriginal cultural lifestyle and the health and well-being of living in a virtual paradise of plenty. In the space of just 7 to 10 years from the time that Threakeld arrived, there had been a marked impact onto that lifestyle.
Bathurst has been put under martial law. You've got atrocities happening on both sides.
That collapse is about to happen in terms of those ongoing traditional practices, knowledges, leadership structures. They're about to collapse.
Into that space comes Threakeld.
Newcastle was a horror show. It's a convict outpost. It's rough, it's awful.
Obviously his experience in the islands before he gets here does not set him up well.
He was really fearful that he was going to get his stuff stolen. I mean, you've got to picture this guy with a young family of girls.
Because he was threatened many, many times. He was threatened with death, and his family too.
They burgled him in Sydney a couple of times, and then he gets to Newcastle, and while the ship's on the wharf, someone pinches the ship that he arrives on with his things. So we're just thinking he's just living in a world full of thieves. By the time they get to their house, the first civilised act that happens is the Aborigines turn up with a kangaroo and they say, look, we're going to be barbecuing this later and dancing. We invite you and your family to come and watch us. So I always use that as the example of who gave him the civilised welcome, and it was the Aboriginal people.
About 40 natives were assembled and the music commenced. 2 sticks knocked together by one of the eldest of the men, which kept good time to the intonation of both male and female performers who changed the tune for the dancers. Some joining in both exercises, keeping the most exact time with the music of the sticks, the strains of the voice, the contortions of the body, and stamping feet.
To have been invited suggests that people either assumed that he was a decent guy, that he was here for the right reasons, or were hoping that he was going to be that. So, it sets a platform for their relationship going forward.
They put him up at the government farm while the missionary station was being built at Belmont. But in that year, that's when he started a friendship with a fellow called McGill, who was an Aboriginal man who they sparked up a friendship, and largely a transference of language started to occur between this pair.
For Biraban, he'd been taken from Newcastle or Coal River as a young boy and placed in service of a British Marine officer in Sydney. And it's there that he learnt the language, and he was able to, as a young boy, observe the British at very close proximity. And he, as a great observer and mimic, and able to take on board all the British customs and accumulate a lot of knowledge about them. So that was in his background.
He's the perfect one for Threlkeld to team up with. He was a warrior, he was very loyal, and I think he genuinely liked Threlkeld. I think he was a man with a lot of integrity, and he didn't just take on what the English said, you've got to do this, this and this. He still went off and done his cultural practices.
Threlkeld was very interested in documenting the language with the intent that he wanted to gain an understanding of it and a mastery of it so he could translate the books of the Bible into the language, and so the Aboriginal people could actually learn the Bible in their own tongue, which was quite the opposite of trying to teach them English so that they could be assimilated. So Threakell was trying to really understand people from inside their own language.
Trying to understand who he is and what his motivation ultimately is. Obviously, he's here to redeem. He's here to help people find the word of the Lord. And to some degree, I think he goes through some exceptional circumstances that must have made him question his reason for being here.
He witnesses Aboriginal healing ceremonies, he witnesses burial and all the ceremonies around that, and he's trusted.
Now I want to just take you to his journals for a minute. Complex, all over the place, sometimes written specifically about travel and about times that he's in court. He's a very important character for this time because it's through his eyes that we actually get to see things.
The balance between male and female in that early Newcastle landscape was a huge number of men versus a very small number of women. And the convicts basically would just roam around at night hunting women. And women, I mean girls, and I mean girls, very little girls.
Heard at night the shrieks of girls, about 8 or 9 years of age, taken by force by the vile men of Newcastle.
The importance of Threakell's journals, to me, as an Aboriginal historian, we have this incredible artefact. Threakeld was the pen and Biraban was the voice, and they brought that together. They recorded everything about stories and Aboriginal ceremonial life, law, hunting.
Threlkeld, in his journals, records the songs that the people were singing at the time. He records poetry in that language, and then he translates it later. Art, that's another thing that he talks about. Engravings in rocks. And he says these people loved fine arts. That then leads him to be able to know what the culture's about.
There's a number of extremely significant Aboriginal spiritual figures that Threlkeld recorded. He recalled being out on Lake Macquarie with Biraban, and I would liken it to a southerly bus that blew up when they were on extremely rough waters, and Threlkeld was a bit disturbed, and he said to Biraban, in times of trouble and fear, who do you look to? And Biraban said, Cone. Cone is the one that we look to and seek out for assistance. So he was unquestionably the most significant local spiritual figure. Threlkeld was able to record all of this because he was an observer and taken along by Aboriginal people like Biraban to observe these things. And it's a great marker on the atrocities that were happening at that time as well. Threlkeld wrote about a group of white men that herded a group of Aboriginal people into a swamp, and they rode around indiscriminately and shot them all off one at a time. After that, they took something like 45 heads which were boiled down and sent back. I mean, we know at that time these skulls were being sent to museums and private collectors.
The skulls at the time were being used by phrenologists as a sort of a pseudo-science of understanding human nature from the bumps on your head.
He also spoke about Aboriginal graves being raided, and he attended a funeral of a young Aboriginal girl, Threakeld, and he said at the time that the Aboriginal mother beseeched him, "Don't let them know where she's buried." And Threakeld said, "Why? Why do you want me to talk about it?" She said, "They will come and they will take her head."
She wouldn't have been able to go to any other white person at the time and asked for that sort of intervention.
When he first came to the country, we were hearing things like working with the savages. And at some point, the language starts to change. He refers to Aboriginal people as sable, meaning black, obviously. But I think it's more of a gentle connection as opposed to savage. So the idea that people were without culture goes out the window and it changes.
We also know the importance of local dreaming stories, and I've recorded for the community over the years something like 27 stories which are embedded in Threakell's writings. Probably one of the standout ones is of the giant kangaroo of what is now Nobbies, which is Wibagumba, when it was an island. And the British decided they would blow the top off Wibagumba and construct a breakwall through the British Marines and the convicts. The local Aboriginal people, I mean that would be the Mullabimba clan then, beseeched Threlkeld. You've got to stop these people. They can't touch the island because there's a giant kangaroo within and his great spirit will be unleashed upon the local area. The British still went ahead and blew the top off the island. And he said, with some jest, that no giant kangaroo was observed. But the reality is in 1989, we know what that story was about. Newcastle was struck by a major earthquake, 13 people died and billions of dollars of damage. And people began to look at that story in a different light because it spoke about the giant kangaroo for being entombed forever for a crime of raping a female wallaby. In his imprisonment, he used to be extremely frustrated, used to bang his giant tail, which Aboriginal people said caused the ground to shake and rocks to fall. And we know in 1989 the ground was shaking and more than rocks were falling, buildings were falling over and toppling down. So again, that's the importance of that story. But it's also the reality of the Aboriginal situation and seeking out someone they thought could assist in defending their position, which was Threakeld.
I believe Biraban at one point was a senior custodian or a senior lawman amongst the region. So if Biraban then starts to take that role and he's then elevated to what we call Biraban, given that role specifically to act as an intermediary to help articulate the needs and wants of the regional people, then clearly his relationship with Threakeld can be understood a little bit better from my perspective, because we see these consistent writings from Threakeld through to the powers that be, whether it be the church or whether it be to the governors of New South Wales. So clearly this could very well have been a relationship of need, but perhaps all advocating for a fair share for everybody.
There's a piece that Threlkeld's written in the 8th report for the mission to the Aborigines at Lake Macquarie here in 1838, and it really gives you an understanding of where this bloke sits. I think it's very powerful.
We are a Christian nation, commanded to love thy neighbour as thyself. As a nation, we have placed ourselves in a position that compelled the Aborigines to become our neighbours. And we have worked ill towards our neighbours, because we, the many, dispossess the few blacks of their rights of birth, which convey to them a certain district in which they seek and obtain their means of subsistence. Our might deprives them of this right without remuneration. And immigration, so beneficial to us as a colony in increasing our population, decreases in an incalculable ratio our neighbours as a people by taking away the common hereditary privileges which they have possessed from time immemorial. The place of their birth is sold to the highest bidder, but the Aborigines would not be included in the purchase. This would be slavery, and that exclusion works to their death.
Yeah, I mean, again, it highlights Threakeld's incredible insight into the situation here and his understanding of Aboriginal connection to country and how that was being denied and the impact onto resources and the land being taken away, no compensation.
Lots of people go, he's just an old Englishman looking through English eyes and he wouldn't have a clue. But that tells me a totally different story about who Threlkeld is. He would go to court for Aboriginal people. Biraban would accompany him as an interpreter. They would go all over the place.
See Aboriginal people in the dock whose testimony is not taken because you had to swear on the Bible, and the only people that could swear on the Bible were Christians who had been baptised. So what do you do with Aboriginal people who are not baptised in the Christian religion and don't understand what a Bible is?
Threlkeld would become the witness for the witness. Biraban himself was asked by one of the judges once about the nature of an oath. He spoke to the judge and told him everything to the point where the judge was convinced he could speak in court. Then he turned around and he said to Threakell, "Have you baptised him?" And he said, "No, I haven't." And unfortunately, that then stopped him from being able to speak for the person in the dock. Our people had their own legal and justice system. All of a sudden, they've got imposed on them a foreign legal system that overruled their legal system. And Threakeld actually goes into that and says, like, these people aren't even given the opportunity to have their own voice. So how on earth are they supposed to have justice under the English justice system? It's ridiculous, but that is English justice. Another reason why Threakeld's doing what he's doing is going around trying to ease them into this, because this is the way of life. This is what's happening, and this is going to continue to happen. And it's still continuing to happen now.
What we can then see is that Threlkeld is driven to help produce this writing, because I think it might go some way towards the colonists having a more generous view of Aboriginal people or First People, rather than just seeing them as obstacles in the way.
The London Missionary Society had asked him to learn the language and then help the people understand the Bible, which was a brilliant idea, really, because what it did was help Aboriginal people become real people in the sense of the European establishment. You're bringing an oral language into a written world whose main law was a book. God was in a book.
The manuscript that I've been working on for the last number of years is his translation of the Gospel of Luke, which amounts to over 250 pages of manuscript. Each of those verses of the Bible has to be analysed for the words it contains and the grammatical relationship between them, and reconstructed so that we understand how it was pronounced in those days and how the whole thing fits together. So, there's quite a lot of work, not just in reconstructing it, but through that you get an idea of how much work went into constructing it in the first place.
You just got to understand the challenge that was ahead of them. I mean, Aboriginal language has thousands upon thousands of years of experience in that language. So those words mean more than just what you think they might mean. And that's been the real challenge of getting them translated into English.
You imagine picking yourself up and going somewhere where you can't understand the language. You've got to learn it. Then you've got to try and write that down some way and make it readable. Then teach it back to the people who can actually speak it. So I think at times they'd think you're a bit stupid because you're trying to learn the language and you can't really speak the language to the degree they can, fluently. So then they'd be laughing at you.
Recording a language that nobody else is going to be able to understand when he produces it on paper. From people who are here speaking fluid language at that particular time, where was the document going to? There must have been for him a greater reason for writing it. He must have been trying to preserve at least some sense of what was here in greater detail. So whilst it might seem futile, because in a short space of time nobody was speaking what it is that he was articulating here, And today, people are trying to recover from that. But what drove him to do it? That's what I want to know as well.
Part of me feels that Biraban was actually using Threlkeld as an arc for the culture and saying, you look after this because I don't know what's going to happen to us in the next few years. It's really gone horrendous in the last 7. God knows what's going to happen in the next, 50. So here's our language, get it right. That's why Threlkeld says everything was repeated 3 times. He used to make sure that he was recording everything. This is why I don't wear this sort of stuff. Oh, but he was making mistakes, he was mishearing. No, he wasn't. It wasn't like he was just recording random word lists like they were doing in Sydney and everywhere else. He uses that example of that guy that was after the name of a native cat. The guy replies Minnering, and the guy starts to write down, native cat equals Minnering, and Threakell goes, no. He's saying, what did you say? He didn't hear you. That's the sort of nuance that you got to understand. This guy wasn't a bozo. He was understanding what he was doing, and I think part of Threlkeld understood that he was creating an arc of the culture as well, in the language, because that's where the culture is kept.
It's very important because it establishes, for the very first time, I think, for lots of us, this earlier groundwork of people fluently speaking in an open space, as opposed to much later on when we're actually, much of the material is actually recorded directly from specific memories of people.
Biraban was his native name, meaning an eagle hawk. He was my almost daily companion for many years, and to his intelligence I am principally indebted for much of my knowledge respecting the structure of the language.
Obviously Biraban done a great job. Threlkeld needs that guide because he's got no clue. His language is still used today in studies.
The work he did has been instrumental in the revival of the language. He misinterpreted some stuff. There are instances where he's interpreted a complete sentence as one word, just because he was unaware at that time of the role of affixes and etc. But he did a really good job, in giving us the bones.
Well, there are a whole lot of reasons for revitalising a language. One of them is that it gives us insight into other ways of understanding the world than the one we have at the present time if we speak just English, but also of the languages that come from the past, because they give us an insight into how those people viewed the world.
Threlkeld recorded all this, had it all printed up. Some of these had runs of like a couple of hundred, and not massive, but it is the first time that an Australian language had ever been printed.
The written translations from Threlkeld are very important because the core functions within the linguistic material establishes a mode of operation that many linguists have been trying to find. They're trying to understand, why is this material so comprehensively written, but what are the bits and pieces? Now, I believe there's a pathway for us to find with that, but certainly what we get here is we get closer detail to those particles of language. So Threlkeld and McGill, or Biraban, at this stage are very important because up until then what we're getting is mainly word lists, a beautiful place, lovely place to camp. But what Threlkeld's actually giving us here is the bits and pieces, how to make something active, how to activate something by the root and the verb, subject, order, verb. So that's what we're getting in this time. What people don't recognise is that Threakell is not the only linguist at the time. Aboriginal people, first people in this country, are also acting as linguists. They're providing the bridge for him. The women in that establishment are also very important now. To some degree they're obscure because of, obviously the end writing is that McGill and Threakell together made this. But by Threakell's own account, there are other people in this space who are giving some of that language material. Threakell, under his own writing, says that his son is a better speaker. Now, clearly, if a child is growing up in a space where everybody is talking at full pace, and this child is running around amongst them, so clearly he would have been a much better speaker because he would have had time and he would have had motivation, particularly if he was playing with Aboriginal kids.
Once he actually settles in the town for 1 year at the government farm and sees what's going on there, he's really happy that they locate where they do in Belmont, which is 2 days away from this hell show.
Threakeld wanted to be out of Newcastle. He wanted to be out at the lake. Because you think about it, he had to cut that road, which would have followed one of our tracks anyway, 14 miles I think. Wouldn't you think, well, I'll just stay here in Newcastle. Say for instance where Lambton is and all that area, he could have just went out there, which was all open forest. So why didn't he go out there? To get people away from the town more.
The mission at Belmont, I think, was about 10,000 acres.
If you have a look at Dangar's map from 1828, there's a huge slab of reserved land. So that was reserved for Aboriginal people, almost like a reservation, I guess, if you wanted to compare it to the American sense.
But it was certainly a large enough space for the first people to retreat to, if needed be.
People think the 10,000 acre mission site is only at Belmont, but it's not. If you go to Swansea Channel and follow the channel around, follow that all the way up to the other side of Biraban, then you cut a line straight across to Dudley. That's how big it is.
Yes, it was the very first, and it's a very important space. I'd love to own it today. I wonder what it'd be worth.
Threlkeld, in moving to the lake, was extremely fortunate because he was connecting with a large Aboriginal group who were living culturally in that really rich space on the lake and probably hadn't been so impacted on at that point in time as the Mullabimba clan of Newcastle. And that was Biraban's clan. So that was the connection, and that's how that came together. This space out there was absolutely beautiful space on the lake, and we know from Reverend Middleton when he was here, he recorded that he was taken out there by 100 Aboriginal people for 3 or 4 days of hunting and fishing, and better days he'd never spent anywhere in the world, with Aboriginal people as their guides and eating the richest saltwater oysters he'd experienced anywhere in the world. And to be there with a fully initiated Aboriginal man, and much respected man as Biraban was, Threlkeld had come into a quite unique space. And his ability with English and to be able to observe and relate and tell those stories was exceptional.
At times Threlkeld had despaired that Biraban was his own man and did his own thing, when Threakeld just wanted him here by his side, writing with him. Biraban had a life, he had stuff to do. Yeah.
He's articulated as travelling off into the mountains, and at this time he produces 30 or 40 boomerangs. Now for me, I understand, or I believe that what he's actually doing is he's making up a part of what we call a kutraman. He's making up the boomerang part that will go into a toolbox, if you like, for young men. So he's clearly got leadership in terms of this traditional, educational, coming-of-age process. And so this relationship with Threlkeld, while it seems that he's always here, that is not in fact true. He's off doing his business out through the region.
Threlkeld made what's called blanket lists, or the returns of Aboriginal natives. And it was sort of like, I suppose, a census thing. Every year they'd come together and they'd be given a blanket or slops, which is old clothing for the men. Threlkeld recorded the names of people in the areas that he lived in. Here at Biraban, there's blanket lists. These are quite important to us because they give us the names of our relatives. He gives their tribal name, he gives their English name, and then he gives their age, which is an estimation of their age. One fella's called Jemmy Jackass, and people would look at that and go, that's really derogatory. But if you actually look at his Aboriginal name, his tribal name is Werrikata, and Werrikata in our language is a Kookaburra. And the English are just going, well, Werrikata's Kookaburra, so we call him Jemmy Jackass, which is the old word for Kookaburra, it's a laughing jackass. Threakeld even goes to the degree that people that are deceased, their name can't be mentioned. He shows us there that he really cares about our people. My great-great-great-grandmother is on that first blanket list that was made. She's on there as Maraka, and then just above her is another family group And in that family group we have Biraban. So he's down as McGill, his English name, and then his Aboriginal name is Wibwong. That's his birth name. Most people's idea of a mission is you're going to church all the time, singing songs, and also modern day thinking of missions, because of what has transpired, it's a penal settlement, basically. People are just getting flogged, they're made to work, and it's a terrible experience for people, and it was. But Threakell was different. He was paying our people money for work, the work that they were doing. They were clearing land, rather than tea and flour and sugar and that. He's given them money.
So I think what he was trying to do was establish an economy of sorts, a space where people could be protected to some degree.
Marsden didn't like that. The church doesn't help at all. He's there representing the church. He needed money, obviously, to clear the land, build huts for our people. He wanted to introduce, I think, 30-acre lots. People could live there and farm it.
The demise for people all over this country has been the expansion of land holdings, land taking. You don't just remove people from freedom to move through country. What you actually do is you restrict them, from their food source, and ultimately in time what you do is you restrict them from the economy. When you take people away from opportunity, where do they have to go? They have to go cap in hand everywhere. It's almost a beg and borrow situation. See, now that's different to Threakeld. What Threakeld was offering was almost on a sharecropper basis. He wrote away and said, with the hope that he might become the protector.
The Aborigines of Australia, who have no combined numbers, no political power to render themselves respected, or rather feared by the invaders of their country, are driven indirectly from their districts as other wild beasts of the desert, without sympathy, when the civilised hand cultivates their soil.
I think that was the difference. He cared for people, and most people don't necessarily want that. They become the little king and they're served. He served them. And in a way, what real religion is you become a servant and you serve the others.
When we start to look at Threakeld, I believe he sees the future.
He was ahead of his time. He saw the issues that are happening even today, back then, and he was trying to give them the tools to deal with that, giving them the opportunities to survive in this new regime that was going on.
But the mission itself had a lot of problems with the amount of money that Threakeld was burning through. So the Missionary Society soon became quite fed up with the bills.
London Missionary Society, through Marsden, took their hands off it and said he's asking for too much money, and the things that he needs it for, money to buy food, to feed people, axes, all this stuff. And they're just blinded to that. The London Missionary Society just withdrew their support completely. That's where it goes sour, and then Threakeld says, well, I'll go and do my own thing. Broughton, who's the Archdeacon, he was friends with Threakeld, and he had a really big interest in Aboriginal people. He then asked the government if they would support Threakeld so that they could keep the mission going. They ended up supporting Threakeld instead of the London Missionary Society.
So sometime after the closing of the Biraban mission, he establishes his property at Ebenezer. And to some degrees, I think he still sees it as a mission.
The area that he's at is Ponty or Pundi, the area we now know today as Toronto. And that's where he's set up the Ebenezer mission. And it's not just that little area where the pub is there today, it's this really huge area. That mission site took in Toronto area, around Blackall's, came down to Kerry Bay, Coal Point, Killaban Bay, and then back over the mountain range to the west there. He's been given another grant of land. He's moved further away from Newcastle because he still wants to continue the work. With that, he discovers this coal there, hence the name Coal Point. So Threakeld was able to use that money that he got from the coal to be able to continue the mission. People sort of go, oh, well, he just become a businessman. But really what he was doing is setting it up so that he could actually fund what he wanted to do. And he still carried on that linguistic work and being a representative for our people in court. So he was still doing all the things that he originally started to do, even though he wasn't under the auspice of the London Missionary Society anymore. When Threlkeld was at Toronto at the Ebenezer Mission, he was visited by people from what was called the US Exploring Expedition. They sent 6 ships out from America, all different scientists, linguists, artists. So this went from 1838 to 1842. They were to collect language, specimens, artefacts from the indigenous people of all over the world.
I think probably the standout connection again would have been Biraban. And people knew in Sydney about this man, his cultural knowledge, his understanding, and again that ability to speak it and connect it and have that opportunity of sitting down with someone of that ilk would have been a great attraction.
The one that came here was Horatio Hale.
And he gives this vivid description of this striking individual, and Hale was completely struck by the man's intelligence and his capacity to teach language, and he said he would go through the word syllable by syllable. He just went through it over and over and over again to make sure you'd fully understood what he was referring to. So it shows the preciseness of Biraban in imparting what he wanted, and that was also now an understanding of what was being relayed to Threakeld as well over a long period of time.
The artist that was with him is Alfred Agate, and he recorded our people. There's pictures of Shingleman and Bamborokan. He took the likeness of Biraban. They recorded our language too. They had nothing to house the collection because it was absolutely massive. You can imagine what they had amassed. From that, they built the Smithsonian Institute in Washington.
I've researched the Wilkes expedition and certainly had the great privilege of spending quite a bit of time in Washington DC and going to the Smithsonian. But the Smithsonian, where materials were collected by the Wilkes expedition and taken back to the US from this region, are held in this massive storage area in Maryland. They've never been on display. And when I went in there, it's like the Indiana Jones movie. You go in and it just goes on and on and up and up. And I had to get the gloves on and pull these trays out. And I saw the magnificent kangaroo possum skin rug that was taken from here. There's only 6 left in the world of those items, and this is unquestionably the most magnificent. To actually see that rug that was taken from here, and other weapons and tools and utensils that this expedition collected, which are there. And I would love to see that rug brought back to Australia, and certainly some of those tools, weapons and utensils. And I think we should pursue that.
In 2009, I'd worked about 5 years, and we were able to get these pictures of our people who we're directly related to. That had been 170 years since when they were first painted to when they were seen again, and that they were actually seen again for the first time in Newcastle.
Biraban expires, he dies. So do many of the people in his community at that time. We start to lose perspective because we're now dealing with the death and dying. At some point, we don't hear from Threakeld. It's as if he's just fallen off the edge of the world. I believe that his son was somewhere near the Myall Creek massacre. He had a property at Bingra. And at some point after that Myall Creek massacre, Threakeld has to sell Ebenezer and all of his holdings in order to pay his son's debt. Much later, he finds himself back in service. He's giving counsel to the Seamen's Home somewhere in Sydney. I can only imagine that the expansion of the colony is far greater than here. And the impact, the disastrous impact on first people in this country is something that not even he could stave off.
All have forever passed away, and the once numerous actors who used to cause the woods to echo with their din now lie mingled with the dust, like their ancestors, to become a tale that is told.
During the 19th century, Threlkeld is releasing works in almost pamphlet form, little book form, and there were other publications all through his time until the 1840s, until his death in the 1850s.
Threakell was forgotten for a period until the Maitland schoolmaster, Dr. John Fraser from Scotland, got hold of a number of Threlkeld manuscripts.
And he revised and edited the work of Lancelot Threlkeld.
And republished them as a book called An Australian Language. He thought that he knew the language better than Threlkeld and that he could correct Threlkeld. He also did some weird things with the spelling. For example, where Threlkeld had written NG for the sound la, which is used at the beginning of words in Aboriginal languages, but not in English, Fraser wrote a G with a dot in the middle of it. Most people interpret this simply as a G rather than as an NG. I imagine he's explained somewhere in the book that it means NG, but most people don't read the fine print.
He experienced some frustration with the fact that Threlkeld didn't record a name or for the people, the language or the country.
And he called the language of this region Awabakal, which was a name he made up based on the name that was written down in a map of 1841 for Lake Macquarie.
He used an affix with the word Awaba and constructed the word Awabakal.
Putting the principles that Threlkeld himself instituted in his 1834 document, where he puts two words together. He uses England, Cal. So the man who belongs to England, so Newcastle Cal, the man who belongs to Newcastle, Mullabimba Cal. Then Fraser uses that to make a Wabba Cal, using the very principle that Threlkeld himself used.
But from that point on, 1892, that's when the word Awabakal starts to be used for the language and for the people, and now people identify under that name.
Fraser was a little bit detached from the original source, which was Threlkeld and Biraban. Threlkeld sat down for a very long time with our people documenting firsthand what the language actually was and did an extremely good job at it. Where Fraser comes later in the piece and basically would not have had access or as much access to primary language speaking people, in my opinion.
This man came along with all of his opinions and rewrote some of Threlkeld's works.
And so when it's condensed into a book, people go, well, it must be true because it's in a book. That's the great difficulty.
This was told to me by linguists at the time because I used to see that book as the definitive guide to Threakeld. They said, no, go back to the originals. Threakeld did a much better job. And so, because I wasn't even aware that they were there, but then we started tracking down all the original publications and they were right. And you can see also the development of how he understands the language and the development from understanding how it works to then translating the Bible into that language.
It was a double-edged sword, the missionaries. Their missions were responsible for the loss of cultural practices and language at that immediate time. But if it hadn't been for Threlkeld's recording of the language back then, it would still be lost. There's no way we'd be able to retrieve it.
I just see those little pamphlets sailing through the 19th century like little ships, like little arcs, and they've come into our age. A lot of people over the years, like Percy Haslam in the 1980s, try to revive the language, trying to get that language taught back in schools. There's been 5 or 6 language studies during the early 2000s. I mean, that's a real joy for me to see that language work start to happen again. And the only reason it is because of what these two guys did back in the 1820s to the 1840s.
They were so far ahead of their time that both of these men have that vision that if you come together like this, then it can change the future. And if they can do that nearly 200 years ago, why can't we be doing that today, that very thing?
I think we need to remember these two on the possibilities of what could have been achieved. They failed to listen to someone like Threlkeld, and in that space also Biraban, of this incredible opportunity to really treasure and recognise the richness of Aboriginal culture and really what could have been recorded right across the country and retained.
I would hope that people would look at them in history and not see them as one-dimensional, to think about the life experiences that both of them brought to that relationship. Then you can say, wow, this is a bigger story than just two people who wrote down a dictionary.
He finishes a letter that he'd written in 1857. He talks about all the things he's had to go through. He finishes with the line, he done what he could. Yes, he did do what he could, all that he could, the best way he could possibly do it.
Imagine somebody sharing this story of these two friends with me as an Aussie kid in the 70s. Oh, just imagine that. And sharing and opening up that world with me of Australia's Indigenous people. What an extraordinary experience. I mean, I got pyramids, I got caves in France, and really the only last couple of hundred years of European history, particularly British, is what we learned. This should be in schools. It should be part of our curriculum. You should have the opportunity to learn this as an Australian.